Marcus Thompson was crouched behind the gymnasium dumpster at 7:52 a.m., frantically trying to scrub the word "loser" off his worn sneakers with a piece of wet cardboard when the three figures rounded the corner. The same three who had cornered him yesterday, the day before that, and every day for the past month. In 30 seconds, those beat-up Converse would become the weapon that brought down the most feared bullies at Riverside High. But not in the way anyone expected. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would turn a 17-year-old scholarship kid from the projects into the most talked about student in the state, and expose a web of corruption that reached all the way to the school board. The autumn morning was crisp in Millfield, Connecticut, where old money and new developments existed in careful separation. Riverside High School sat exactly on that invisible line, its modern glass facade reflecting both the historic colonial homes of Elm Street and the affordable housing complex known locally as the Quarters. Marcus had been making the 40-minute walk from the Quarters to Riverside every morning for 6 weeks now, ever since his family had moved from Hartford after his father lost his job at the insurance company. The transition had been brutal, in ways that went far beyond the obvious. Marcus Thompson was not the kind of kid who attracted attention by choice. At 17, he stood just under 6 feet with the lean build of someone who had grown up playing basketball on cracked asphalt, courts where you learn to be quick or get hurt. His dark skin held the warmth of summer even in October, and his eyes carried an intelligence that his guidance counselor had described as remarkable potential when recommending him for Riverside's Academic Excellence Program. The program was designed to bring high-achieving students from underserved communities into one of Connecticut's most prestigious public schools, complete with transportation vouchers and free lunch. What it didn't come with was a roadmap for navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed teenage life in an affluent suburb. The shoes that would later become legendary were a pair of black Converse All-Stars that Marcus had bought with his own money from his summer job at a community center in Hartford. They had cost him $43, which represented 2 weeks of carefully saved earnings, and he had chosen them specifically because they were classic, timeless, the kind of shoes that wouldn't draw attention or mark him as different. The irony was not lost on him that the very shoes he had selected to blend in had become the focal point of his daily humiliation. It had started during his second week at Riverside, in the cafeteria where social dynamics played out with the precision of a military operation. Marcus had been sitting alone, methodically working through a ham sandwich his mother had packed, when he noticed the conversations around him gradually quieting. The sudden hush that fell over teenage social spaces usually meant one of two things: a fight was about to break out, or someone important had arrived. In this case, it was the latter. Jake Morrison commanded attention the way some people commanded respect, through a combination of natural charisma and carefully cultivated intimidation. At 18, he was the kind of handsome that looked effortless but probably required significant maintenance, with sandy brown hair that always fell perfectly across his forehead and green eyes that seemed to catalog weaknesses in everyone they surveyed. His father owned Morrison Development, the company responsible for half the luxury condominiums sprouting up around Millfield, and his mother sat on the school board alongside several other wealthy parents who treated Riverside High as their personal project. Jake's inner circle consisted of 2 other boys who shared his particular blend of privilege and cruelty. Derek Sullivan was the son of Millfield's police chief, a fact he wielded like a weapon when situations required more than social pressure to resolve. Derek had inherited his father's imposing frame and his mother's sharp tongue, making him the perfect enforcer for Jake's more elaborate schemes. The third member of their group was Alex Chun, whose parents had moved to Millfield from California after selling a tech startup for an amount that local gossip placed somewhere in the 8-figure range. Alex handled the technical aspects of their operations, the social media campaigns and digital harassment that modern bullying required to be truly effective. The three of them moved through Riverside High like a small army, leaving behind them a trail of students who had learned to keep their heads down and their opinions to themselves. They had perfected the art of systematic intimidation, targeting students who lacked the social connections or family influence to fight back effectively. Marcus, with his scholarship status and address in the quarters, might as well have painted a target on his back the moment he walked through Riverside's front doors. The first incident had been almost casual, the kind of interaction that could have been dismissed as typical teenage behavior if viewed in isolation. Jake had noticed Marcus in the lunch line and commented loudly to his friends about the interesting fashion choices of Riverside's newest students. The comment had been accompanied by a pointed look at Marcus's shoes, which, while clean and well-maintained, clearly bore the marks of regular wear and careful repair. A small scuff on the left toe where Marcus had caught it on a concrete step. A slight separation near the sole where the rubber had begun to pull away from the canvas after months of daily use. Marcus had pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the lunch lady who was ladling mashed potatoes onto his tray with the kind of institutional efficiency that suggested she had witnessed countless similar scenes and preferred to remain neutral. But Jake Morrison was not the type to let a perceived slight go unacknowledged, and Marcus's failure to respond had been interpreted as either defiance or ignorance, both of which required correction in Jake's worldview. The escalation had been methodical and sophisticated, displaying the kind of strategic thinking that might have been admirable if applied to more constructive purposes. Jake had begun by researching Marcus's background, a task made easier by Alex's technical skills and Derek's access to school records through his father's connections. They had discovered Marcus's address in the quarters, his scholarship status, his father's unemployment, and his mother's job cleaning offices downtown. Armed with this information, they had crafted a campaign designed to isolate Marcus socially while maintaining plausible deniability if any authority figures became involved. The shoe mockery had started as a running joke among Jake's broader social circle, spreading through the cafeteria and hallways like a virus designed specifically to target Marcus's confidence. Students who had never spoken to Marcus began pointing and whispering when he walked by, their conversations punctuated by barely suppressed laughter and meaningful glances at his feet. Someone had created an Instagram account called Riverside Fashion Police that posted photos of various students' footwear with sarcastic commentary. But Marcus's shoes appeared with suspicious frequency, always accompanied by captions that managed to be cruel without crossing into territory that would trigger administrative intervention. The psychological effect had been immediate and devastating. Marcus found himself checking his shoes constantly, scrubbing them with increasing desperation each morning before school, even attempting to hide the scuff marks with black permanent marker that only made them more noticeable. His mother had noticed his growing anxiety about his appearance and had offered to buy him new shoes, but Marcus knew that his family's budget was already stretched thin by the move to Millfield and his father's continued job search. He had declined the offer, telling his mother that his shoes were fine, that kids would always find something to tease about, that he could handle it. But Marcus Thompson was not handling it, not in any meaningful sense. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His grades, which had been the foundation of his admission to Riverside's excellence program, began to slip as he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate in classes where he felt every pair of eyes judging his appearance, his participation. In class discussions, once enthusiastic and insightful, dwindled to the bare minimum required to avoid drawing additional attention. His appetite disappeared, making the free lunch program irrelevant since he could barely force himself to eat. While surrounded by students who seemed to view his presence as entertainment, The situation might have continued indefinitely, with Marcus gradually retreating further into isolation until he either transferred schools or simply stopped attending, if not for two factors that Jake Morrison had failed to account for in his careful planning. The first was Marcus's mother, Diana Thompson, who possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of injustice that came from a lifetime of fighting battles that others preferred to ignore. The second was Marcus himself, who, despite his quiet demeanor and careful attempts to avoid conflict, carried within him a strategic intelligence that his tormentors had mistaken for weakness. Diana Thompson had been born in Jamaica and had immigrated to the United States with her parents when she was 12 years old, carrying with her a deep understanding of what it meant to be viewed as an outsider in spaces where your presence was tolerated but not welcomed. She had worked her way through community college while raising Marcus, earning a degree in social work that she had been unable to use in a meaningful career due to the demands of single parenthood and economic necessity. Instead, she had taken whatever work was available, most recently cleaning offices in downtown Hartford during evening hours that allowed her to be home when Marcus returned from school. Diana had noticed the changes in her son immediately, the way he had begun checking his appearance obsessively before leaving for school, the increasing frequency with which she found him scrubbing his shoes in their small bathroom sink, the gradual withdrawal from conversations about his day that had once been filled with excitement about his classes and teachers. When she had attempted to address the issue directly, Marcus had deflected with the kind of practiced casualness that teenagers use to avoid parental intervention in their social lives. But Diana Thompson had not raised her son for 17 years without learning to recognize when his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. She had seen the same patterns in her clients during her brief stint working at a community center in Hartford. The way young people retreated into themselves when faced with systematic harassment that they believed adults were either unwilling or unable to address. She had also learned from her social work training that the most effective interventions often came not from direct confrontation with perpetrators, but from empowering victims to advocate for themselves while ensuring they had the support and resources necessary to do so effectively. The conversation that changed everything had taken place on a rainy Wednesday evening in early October, when Diana had returned home from work to find Marcus sitting at their small kitchen table, staring at his shoes with an expression of such profound defeat that it had broken her heart. The shoes were spread out on newspaper, surrounded by cleaning supplies and what appeared to be the remnants of several failed attempts to repair or disguise their wear. Marcus had looked up when she entered, and Diana had seen in his eyes the same look she had witnessed in too many young people who had been systematically taught that their worth was determined by others' approval. "Baby," Diana had said, settling into the chair across from him, "tell me what's really going on." The story that emerged over the next 2 hours had been both more and less than Diana had expected. More in terms of the sophistication and cruelty of the harassment campaign that Jake Morrison and his friends had orchestrated. Less in terms of the fundamental dynamics at play, which Diana recognized as variations on themes she had encountered throughout her own life and career. What struck her most was not the behavior of the bullies, which while inexcusable was unfortunately predictable, but rather Marcus's response to it. Her son had been documenting everything. Marcus had shown her a composition notebook that he had been carrying with him to school every day, filled with detailed accounts of each incident of harassment. Dates, times, locations, witnesses, exact quotes when possible. Screenshots of social media posts saved before they could be deleted. Photos of his vandalized locker, his damaged belongings, the graffiti that appeared on surfaces near his classes. He had even recorded several conversations using his phone, creating an audio record of interactions that would have been impossible to prove otherwise. "Why haven't you shown this to anyone at school?" Diana had asked, flipping through pages of meticulous documentation that would have impressed a professional investigator. Marcus had looked at her with an expression that was equal parts frustration and resignation. "Mom, you don't understand how this works." Jake's mom is on the school board. Derek's dad is the police chief. Alex's parents donated the computer lab. These aren't just random kids being mean. They run that school, and everyone knows it. If I complain, it just makes everything worse. Diana had studied her son's face, seeing in it not just the exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle, but also the calculating intelligence of someone who had been planning for a different kind of victory. "So what are you going to do?" Marcus had smiled then, the first genuine smile Diana had seen from him in weeks. "I'm going to let them think they've won. And then I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate someone because of where they come from." The plan that Marcus outlined for his mother that evening was ambitious, risky, and demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that impressed even Diana, who had spent years working with young people facing seemingly impossible challenges. Marcus had realized that his documentation, while comprehensive, was not sufficient to challenge students whose families wielded significant influence within the school system. He needed something more, something that would make it impossible for administrators to dismiss or minimize his complaints. He needed Jake Morrison to cross a line so public and undeniable that even the most reluctant authority figures would be forced to take action. The genius of Marcus's plan lay in its simplicity and its reliance on his tormentor's own arrogance and sense of invulnerability. Jake Morrison had grown accustomed to operating without consequences, confident that his family's status and his own social position provided him with effective immunity from serious repercussions. This confidence had made him increasingly bold in his harassment of Marcus, escalating from verbal comments to more direct forms of intimidation. Marcus had observed this pattern and had begun to subtly encourage it, responding to Jake's provocations in ways that would frustrate him without providing clear justification for more aggressive retaliation. When Jake made comments about his shoes, Marcus would thank him for his fashion advice with such sincere politeness that Jake couldn't determine if he was being mocked. When Derek tried to physically intimidate him in hallways, Marcus would step aside with exaggerated courtesy, making the aggression seem absurdly one-sided to any witnesses. The effect had been to gradually increase Jake's frustration while making Marcus appear increasingly sympathetic to neutral observers. Students who had initially been entertained by the harassment began to view it as excessive, particularly as Marcus's calm responses highlighted the pettiness of his tormentor's behavior. Teachers who had previously dismissed the situation as typical teenage drama began to notice the pattern of escalation and the one-sided nature of the conflict. But Marcus's most important preparation had been technological, working with equipment borrowed from the community center where he had volunteered. During the summer, he had learned to use professional-grade audio and video recording equipment, understanding not just how to capture clear evidence, but how to do so in ways that would be legally admissible if necessary. He had researched Connecticut's laws regarding recording conversations, discovering that as long as one party to a conversation consented to recording, the evidence could be used in both civil and criminal proceedings. He had also spent considerable time researching the backgrounds of his tormentors, using public records and social media to compile information that painted a picture of systematic misbehavior that extended far beyond their treatment of him. Jake Morrison had been involved in several incidents at previous schools that had been quietly resolved through his father's influence. Derek Sullivan had multiple juvenile citations that had been dismissed through his father's connections. Alex Chun had been suspended from his previous school in California for cyberbullying before his family's move to Connecticut. Most importantly, Marcus had discovered that Riverside High's administration was under increasing scrutiny from both state education officials and federal civil rights investigators following a series of complaints about discriminatory treatment of minority students. The school's diversity statistics were abysmal for a district receiving federal funding, and several recent graduates had filed formal complaints alleging systematic harassment that had driven them to transfer to other schools. This context meant that Marcus's situation was not occurring in isolation, but rather as part of a larger pattern that education officials were already monitoring. Any incident that could be clearly documented and presented as evidence of ongoing discrimination would trigger investigations that the school administration desperately wanted to avoid, particularly with accreditation reviews scheduled for the following year. Marcus had also identified potential allies within the school system, teachers and staff members who had expressed concern about the climate at Riverside, but who lacked the documentation necessary to challenge students from influential families. Ms. Jennifer Rodriguez, the new Spanish teacher who had transferred from an urban district in New Haven, had already noticed the social dynamics that marginalized scholarship students and had made several unsuccessful attempts to address the issue through official channels. Mr. David Kim, the math department head who also served as faculty advisor for the academic decathlon team, had witnessed several incidents involving Marcus and had expressed frustration with the administration's unwillingness to take meaningful action. The final piece of Marcus's strategy involved timing and location. He had observed that Jake Morrison's most aggressive behavior typically occurred in spaces that were technically supervised, but where adult attention was often distracted or absent. The area behind the gymnasium where students gathered before first period was perfect for this purpose, offering enough privacy for Jake to feel comfortable escalating his behavior, while still being accessible to witnesses and recording equipment. Marcus had also noted that Jake's frustration levels were highest on Monday mornings, particularly after weekends when he had been unable to engage in his typical harassment routine. The combination of accumulated frustration and the semi-private setting created ideal conditions for provoking the kind of public incident that would be impossible for school officials to ignore or minimize. The morning that would later be remembered as the beginning of the end for Jake Morrison's reign of terror began with Marcus arriving at school 30 minutes earlier than usual, carrying with him the recording equipment he had been preparing for weeks. He had chosen his clothing carefully, wearing a button-down shirt that would clearly display his scholarship program pin and pants that would make his carefully maintained shoes more visible than usual. He had also brought with him a printed copy of every piece of documentation he had compiled over the past month, organized in a folder that would be easily accessible if needed. His phone was fully charged and set to automatically upload any recordings to a cloud storage account that he shared with his mother, ensuring that evidence could not be lost or destroyed even if his device was confiscated or damaged. Most importantly, Marcus had prepared himself mentally for what was about to happen. He had rehearsed his responses to various scenarios, practicing the kind of calm, measured reactions that would make any aggression directed toward him appear disproportionate and unjustified. He had also steeled himself for the possibility that his plan might fail, that Jake Morrison's family influence might ultimately protect him from consequences, even in the face of clear evidence. But as Marcus positioned himself behind the gymnasium dumpster that morning, checking his recording equipment one final time while waiting for his tormentors to appear, he felt a confidence that surprised him. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, he was not reacting to someone else's agenda, but implementing his own. He was not a victim waiting for rescue, but an agent of his own justice, armed with evidence, allies, and a plan that would either free him from harassment or provide him with the documentation necessary to pursue other options. The sound of approaching voices interrupted his thoughts, and Marcus looked up to see Jake Morrison, Derek Sullivan, and Alex Chun rounding the corner with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested they had planned this encounter as deliberately as he had. Jake was carrying something in his right hand, though Marcus couldn't quite make out what it was from his position behind the dumpster. Well, Jake's voice carried clearly in the morning air, loud enough to be heard by the dozen or so other students who were beginning to gather in the area before first period. Look who's trying to hide behind the trash where he belongs. Marcus stood slowly, making sure his recording device was positioned to capture both audio and video of the interaction. He had practiced this moment dozens of times, but the reality of facing his tormentors with the knowledge that everything was about to change still sent adrenaline coursing through his system. "Good morning, Jake," Marcus said with the kind of polite formality that he knew would irritate his antagonist. "Derek, Alex, beautiful day, isn't it?" Jake's expression darkened at the casual use of their names, interpreting Marcus's familiarity as either disrespect or mockery. "Don't you dare act like we're friends, scholarship boy. You think because you've been here a few weeks you belong with us?" Marcus could see other students beginning to pull out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. This was exactly what he had been hoping for: multiple witnesses with their own recording capabilities, creating a situation where evidence would be impossible to suppress or discredit. "I don't want to belong with you," Marcus replied honestly, his voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd of onlookers. "I just want to get an education without being harassed every day." Derek stepped forward, his bulk clearly intended to be intimidating. "Maybe if you dressed like you belonged here instead of wearing those pathetic shoes, you wouldn't get so much attention." The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the obvious tension and the novelty of seeing someone stand up to Jake Morrison's crew. Marcus could see Ms. Rodriguez approaching from the direction of the faculty parking lot, though she was still too far away to intervene if the situation escalated quickly. Alex held up his phone, apparently recording the interaction for his own purposes. "This is going to be great content for the Fashion Police account. Maybe we should get a close-up of those sad excuses for shoes." Marcus looked down at his feet, at the Converse All-Stars that had become the symbol of everything wrong with his experience at Riverside High. They were clean, carefully maintained, and perfectly adequate for their purpose. The only thing wrong with them was that they cost $43 instead of $200, that they came from a regular store instead of a boutique, that they belonged to a scholarship student instead of the son of a developer. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he looked back up at his tormentors. "You're right about my shoes. They tell a story about who I am and where I come from. They're worn because I walk everywhere instead of getting driven in a BMW. They're scuffed because I actually use them instead of collecting them like trophies. They're clean because I take care of what I have instead of throwing things away when they're not perfect anymore." Jake's face was flushing red now, and Marcus could see that his carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the point where Jake's frustration would overcome his judgment and lead him to cross the line that would trigger consequences even his family couldn't prevent. "You think you're better than us?" Jake demanded, taking a step closer to Marcus. "You think your poverty makes you noble or something? You're nothing but charity case, and these shoes prove it." That's when Jake revealed what he had been carrying. In his right hand, a pair of expensive designer sneakers, pristine white with gold accents, still bearing their price tags. The kind of shoes that cost more than Marcus's family spent on groceries in a month. "These," Jake said, holding the shoes up for the crowd to see, "are what real shoes look like. What successful people wear. What you'll never be able to afford." Marcus could see Ms. Rodriguez getting closer, and he knew he had only a few more moments before adult intervention would end the confrontation. He needed Jake to escalate just a little bit more, to move from verbal harassment into territory that would be impossible to dismiss as teenage banter. "Those are very nice shoes, Jake," Marcus said calmly. "I'm sure your parents are proud that they can afford to buy you things that expensive." The comment hit its mark perfectly, implying without directly stating that Jake's possessions were unearned, that his value came entirely from his family's wealth rather than his own accomplishments. Jake's carefully controlled mask finally slipped completely, revealing the rage and entitlement that had been driving his behavior all along. "You know what?" Jake snarled, raising the expensive sneakers above his head. "Since you seem to think Your pathetic shoes are so great. Let's see how they look after this." What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times over the following weeks, analyzed by legal experts and education professionals, and ultimately used as evidence in multiple investigations. Jake Morrison, son of one of Millfield's most influential families, deliberately and publicly threw a pair of $400 sneakers at Marcus Thompson with enough force to knock him backward into the dumpster. The shoes struck Marcus in the chest, their metal eyelets leaving scratches on his shirt and a small cut on his neck. The impact was hard enough to be clearly assault by any legal definition, committed in front of dozens of witnesses with multiple recording devices capturing every moment. But it was what happened in the 30 seconds after the shoes hit their target that would transform Marcus Thompson from victim to victor and expose a network of corruption that reached far beyond simple case of teenage bullying. Marcus looked down at the expensive sneakers that had fallen at his feet, then back up at Jake Morrison's face, which was already beginning to show the first signs of panic as he realized what he had just done in front of so many witnesses. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone understanding that they had just witnessed something that crossed the line from harassment into criminal behavior. And then Marcus smiled. Marcus looked down at the expensive sneakers that had fallen at his feet, then back up at Jake Morrison's face, which was already beginning to show the first signs of panic as he realized what he had just done in front of so many witnesses. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone understanding that they had witnessed something that crossed the line from harassment into criminal behavior. And then Marcus smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been humiliated or defeated. It was the smile of someone who had just received exactly what they had been waiting for, wrapped in Jake Morrison's own arrogance and delivered with perfect timing. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, making sure the recording app was still running, then looked directly into Jake's eyes. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent crowd. "You just made this incredibly easy." Jake's confidence began to crack visibly. "Made what easy?" "Everything," Marcus replied, bending down to pick up the designer sneakers that Jake had thrown at him. As he stood back up, he held them carefully like evidence, which they now were. Assault with a weapon in front of 47 witnesses. The scratches on my neck from the metal eyelets. The video evidence from at least 12 different phones. The clear pattern of harassment that led to this moment. Derek Sullivan stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "It was just shoes, man. Stop being so dramatic. Just shoes?" Marcus pulled out a small notebook from his back pocket, the same one he had been carrying for weeks. "Let me tell you about just shoes, Derek. October 3rd, cafeteria. Jake Morrison makes racist comment about urban fashion choices directed at my footwear. October 7th, hallway outside chemistry lab. Derek Sullivan deliberately steps on my shoes while calling them ghetto. October 12th, Alex Chun posts photo of my shoes on Instagram with caption, "When charity cases try to fit in." Alex's face went pale as Marcus continued reading from his documentation. Should I keep going? Because I have 37 documented incidents over the past 6 weeks, all witnessed, most recorded, several involving criminal behavior that your parents' money has been covering up. Ms. Rodriguez had finally reached the group, her expression shifting from concern to shock as she took in the scene. The expensive sneakers in Marcus's hands, the scratch on his neck, the sea of phones capturing everything, and most importantly, the complete transformation in power dynamics that was obvious to everyone present. "What's going on here?" she demanded, though her tone suggested she already understood the basic situation. "Jake Morrison just committed assault," Marcus said calmly, holding up the sneakers. "He threw these at me hard enough to draw blood. As you can see from the scratch on my neck and the 47 witnesses who recorded it happening. Jake found." His voice again, desperation creeping in. "It was an accident. I was just showing him what real shoes look like, and they slipped. Slipped? Marcus pulled out his phone and played back the audio recording he had been making. Jake's own voice filled the air, crystal clear. "Since you seem to think your pathetic shoes are so great, let's see how they look after this." The crowd began to murmur, students pulling out their own phones to check their recordings, realizing they had captured something significant. Several were already posting to social media, and Marcus could see the notification counts climbing rapidly on various platforms. "Mr. Morrison," Ms. Rodriguez said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who had dealt with similar situations in urban schools, "you need to come with me to the principal's office immediately." "You can't prove anything," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My mom is on the school board. She have your job if you try to make this into something it's not." That's when Marcus played his trump card. He pulled out a manila folder from his backpack, thick with documentation that he had been preparing for exactly this moment. "Actually, Jake, let's talk about proof. And let's talk about your mother's position on the school board." He opened the folder and pulled out a series of printed emails, holding them up for Ms. Rodriguez to see. "These are correspondence between board members discussing how to handle the scholarship student problem. At Riverside High, your mother specifically suggested that making the environment less comfortable for students from certain backgrounds would encourage them to transfer to more appropriate schools." Ms. Rodriguez's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength with each revelation. "Derek, should we discuss your father's practice of filing false police reports to justify harassment of minority students? Or Alex, would you prefer to talk about the cyberbullying operation you've been running across 3 different platforms?" Derek's tough guy facade crumbled completely. "How did you get that information?" "Freedom of Information Act requests," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "Police reports are public records. School board emails are subject to sunshine laws. Social media posts leave digital footprints. Amazing what you can discover when you actually research instead of just assuming your privilege will protect you." Alex was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to delete evidence, but Marcus shook his head. "Too late for that. Alex, I've been documenting everything for weeks. Screenshots, archived pages, cached versions. It's all been backed up to multiple cloud servers and shared with my mother, who happens to be very well connected with civil rights organizations." The crowd was growing larger as word spread through the school that something major was happening behind the gymnasium. Students were arriving from all directions, drawn by social media posts and text messages describing the confrontation. Marcus could see several teachers heading their way, including Mr. Kim from the math department, who had witnessed previous incidents. Principal Patricia Williams arrived with 2 security guards, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene. Williams was a career educator who had been brought in specifically to address Riverside's diversity problems, but she had been fighting an uphill battle against entrenched interests and influential parents who resisted meaningful change. "Ms. Rodriguez, what's the situation here?" Williams asked, though she was already examining the scratch on Marcus's neck and the expensive sneakers he was holding. "Assault," Ms. Rodriguez replied firmly. "Jake Morrison threw those shoes at Marcus Thompson hard enough to cause injury. There are dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings of the incident." Principal Williams looked at Jake, whose arrogance had completely evaporated. "Is this true, Mr. Morrison?" Before Jake could answer, Marcus stepped forward. "Principal Williams, I'd like to file formal complaints about systematic harassment, assault, cyberbullying, and civil rights violations. I have extensive documentation of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has been escalating for weeks." He handed her the manila folder, which she began examining with increasing concern. "I also have evidence that suggests certain board members and community officials may have been complicit in creating an environment that enables this kind of behavior." Jake made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "This is all lies. He's just trying to get attention because he doesn't fit in here. Maybe if he went back to where he belongs. He never finished the sentence. The racist implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud, captured by dozens of recording devices and witnessed by a crowd that included several teachers and the principal herself. Even students who had previously been neutral or supportive of Jake began to step away from him, recognizing that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "That's enough," Principal Williams said sharply. "Mr. Morrison, you're suspended. Immediately pending investigation. Security will escort you to collect your belongings and then off campus. Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Chun, you're also suspended pending review of the evidence Mr. Thompson has provided." The security guards moved to flank the three boys, but Derek made one final mistake. "You can't do this to us. Our families run this town. We'll have your jobs." Principal Williams turned to face him directly. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been an educator for 23 years. I've dealt with entitled students and helicopter parents before. What I haven't dealt with is video evidence of assault and documented proof of systematic civil rights violations. Your families may run this town, but they don't run the Department of Education, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, or the State Attorney General's office." Marcus watched as his tormentors were led away, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that their world had just collapsed around them. But he wasn't finished. The assault had been the trigger, but the real work was just beginning. Over the next hour, as statements were taken and evidence was collected, the scope of what Marcus had uncovered became clear. His documentation revealed a pattern of discrimination that went far beyond teenage bullying. The Instagram account that had targeted him was part of a larger network designed to harass scholarship students and minorities. The fashion police posts had been coordinated with other social media campaigns aimed at creating a hostile environment for students from certain backgrounds. More damaging were the communications he had obtained between parents and school officials, discussing strategies to reduce diversity at Riverside High. Jake's mother had been part of a group that had advocated for changing scholarship criteria to exclude students from urban areas. Derek's father had used his position to pressure families into transferring their children to other schools. Alex's parents had threatened to withdraw funding for technology programs unless certain students were removed from advanced classes. The investigation that followed moved with unprecedented speed. The viral videos of Jake's assault and racist comments had attracted national attention, with civil rights organizations and media outlets picking up the story. The hashtag Riverside Reckoning began trending, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and bullying. By the end of the week, the consequences were devastating for Marcus's former tormentors. Jake Morrison was expelled and faced criminal charges for assault and hate crimes. The college acceptances he had received were rescinded as institutions reviewed his character. His father's development company lost several major contracts as community partners distanced themselves from the family name. Derek Sullivan's father was forced to resign from his position as police chief after an investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct in cases involving minority residents. Derek himself was transferred to a juvenile facility after additional charges were filed related to previous incidents that had been covered up. Alex Chun's family chose to leave Millfield entirely, moving back to California after their son's cyberbullying activities were exposed in detail. The sophisticated nature of the harassment campaigns he had orchestrated led to federal charges that would follow him wherever he went. But the most significant changes happened at Riverside High itself. Principal Williams used Marcus's documentation to build a comprehensive case for reform that the school board couldn't ignore, especially with federal investigators now examining their practices. Board members who had been implicated in discriminatory communications were forced to resign, including Jake's mother. New policies were implemented requiring immediate reporting of harassment incidents to state authorities. A peer mediation program was established with Marcus as its first student coordinator. Diversity training became mandatory for all staff and students. The school's mission statement was rewritten to explicitly commit to creating an inclusive environment for all students. Marcus himself became something he had never expected to be: famous. His strategic approach to documenting and exposing systematic discrimination was studied in civil rights courses. Speaking requests poured in from schools and organizations across the country. College recruiters who had never heard of him before began offering full scholarships that went far beyond what the academic excellence program had provided. The most satisfying moment came 6 months later during Riverside High's first annual Diversity and Inclusion Day. Marcus stood before an assembly of students, teachers, parents, and community members. Wearing a brand new pair of shoes that had been given to him by a sneaker company that wanted to support his advocacy work, but he had chosen not to wear them that day. Instead, he wore his original black Converse All-Stars, now carefully repaired and maintained, bearing their scuffs and wear marks like badges of honor. "These shoes," he said, looking out at the audience that included many of the same students who had once laughed at them, "tell the story of where I came from and how far I've traveled. They remind me that worth isn't measured by price tags or brand names, but by the character of the person wearing them." He paused, his eyes finding Ms. Rodriguez in the audience, then Mr. Kim, then Principal Williams, all of whom had become allies in the transformation of Riverside High. "Jake Morrison was right about one thing," Marcus continued. "These shoes do represent who I am. They represent someone who doesn't give up when faced with injustice. Someone who documents truth instead of accepting lies. Someone who believes that change is possible when people have the courage to demand it." The applause that followed was different from the nervous laughter that had once greeted discussions of his appearance. It was the sound of genuine respect, earned through intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking rather than inherited through family wealth or social position. After the assembly, Marcus was approached by a young freshman named David Martinez, whose family had recently moved to Millfield from El Salvador. David was wearing a pair of worn sneakers that looked remarkably similar to the ones Marcus had been mocked for months earlier. "Thank you," David said quietly, "for making it safe for people like us to be here." Marcus looked down at David's shoes, then at his own, then smiled. "Those are great shoes," he said. "They look like they belong to someone who knows where he's going." 6 months later, Marcus received a letter that surprised him more than all the college offers and speaking requests combined. It was from Jake Morrison, written from the juvenile detention facility where he was serving his sentence. The letter was brief and painful to read, filled with the kind of genuine remorse that only came from facing real consequences for the first time in someone's life. Jake described the shock of discovering that actions had permanent repercussions, that privilege had limits, that the world outside his bubble operated by different rules than he had been taught. But what struck Marcus most was the final paragraph. "I keep thinking about that morning behind the gymnasium. You smiled when I threw those shoes at you, and I couldn't understand why. Now I realize you were smiling because you knew that I had just handed you everything you needed to change things for everyone who came after you. I was so focused on trying to make you feel small that I made myself smaller instead. I hope someday I can be the kind of person who builds people up instead of tearing them down." Marcus read the letter twice before putting it away. He had no intention of responding, not because he was still angry, but because Jake's journey toward redemption had to be his own work, not something Marcus needed to validate or facilitate. The real victory wasn't Jake's apology or Derek's disgrace, or Alex's exile. The real victory was walking through the halls of Riverside High and seeing students from all backgrounds learning together, supporting each other, creating the kind of community that Marcus had dreamed of when he first arrived as a scholarship student from the quarters. His shoes had become a symbol, but not in the way his tormentors had intended. They represented resilience, strategic thinking, the power of documentation, and the possibility of transformation, even in systems designed to resist change. Years later, when Marcus Thompson had graduated from college and begun his career as a civil rights attorney, he would keep those original Converse All-Stars in his office as a reminder of how much could change in 30 seconds when someone had the courage to stand up for justice and the intelligence to make it stick. The boy who had been mocked for his shoes had grown into a man who helped others find their footing in a world that often seemed designed to trip them up. And every time he looked at those worn sneakers, he remembered that sometimes the most powerful weapons against injustice were patience, preparation, and the willingness to let your enemies destroy themselves with their own hatred. The revolution that started with ridicule had become a legacy of respect. The shoes that were meant to mark him as different had marked him as someone who would make a difference. And in the end, that made all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.